as my slightly melodramatic title, which does, however, have the virtue of being less pompous than Brad's, suggests.
Less pompous than me isn't exactly a virtue.
I think there's nothing radical about Mormon homemaking as currently practiced, and particularly as currently envisioned as the manifestation of women's essential nature and the most righteous roles she may perform. Notions about home, and in particular about motherhood and homemaking, have both reflected and informed Mormon doctrine and practice, and the degree to which Mormon anxieties about the Church's participation in the public sphere, being in the world, have been by turns assuaged and amplified by constructing an idealized domestic sphere presided over by women. So this morning I want to take a ridiculously broad, sloppy romp, although not as ridiculously broad and sloppy as Brad.
Not several millennia.
Not starting with Plato. Through the history of how domestic life has figured in the involvement of North American Mormons with the surrounding society. Armin Moss's articulation of the need for new religious groups to create optimal tension with the host society is a useful way to think through some of these questions. So in the early Utah period, pre-statehood, the tension with the outside society was created by war with the federal government. It's pretty tense, over theocracy and social controversy over polygamy, as well as geographical distance, obviously. The fight over polygamy rendered the private and domestic exquisitely public and political. And Mormons spent so much time defending the fundamental structure of their families to the outside world that there was little rhetorical energy left over for prescriptions about the content of domestic life. Both men and women were implicated in resisting the capitalist, individualist, corporate modes of modernity, as were the public and private spheres in roughly equal proportions. Women were responsible for maintaining cooperative, polygynous homes, while men were engaged in creating cooperative economic and political structures. But after the end of polygamy and the assimilation or dissolution of Deseret into Utah, the resistance to modernity was maintained only within the private sphere, and it became gendered. It was women who accomplished the transition from polygamous to monogamous Mormon families, and who then preserved remnants of the communitarian economy in their relief society and primary work. Ironically, these civic efforts of women were modeled on a form of civic involvement that had been influential in the anti-polygamy crusades of the late 19th century. One editorial writer had in fact described the anti-polygamy protests as being comprised of, quote, every known society from the Young Men's Sewing Circle of Cranberry, Wisconsin, to the Heavyset Ladies Glee Club of New York. Mormon women adopted the rhetoric and habits of what was by then the fading culture of women's clubs and benevolent societies, championing the belief that women's moral purity should exercise a civilizing influence in the political realm. They made the tenets of early first-wave feminism into religious principles, elevating sentimentality about motherhood and housekeeping to the level of theological axioms. One of my favorite places where you see this is in some of the primary songs that show up early on. There's a particular favorite of mine called Washing Dishes that says, in a right way or a wrong way, washing dishes may be done. We will show you now the right way, that the battle may be won. Righteous dishwashing.
You made that up.
I didn't, I swear. But this femininity still had a place in Mormon communal life. The list of civic societies, Amy Brown Lyman, for instance, who was involved in the general presidency of the Relief Society from 1928 to 1945, for instance, belonged to or chaired, was long enough that the Heavyset Women's Singing Circle might well have been hidden amongst the social reform organizations which she belonged to or chaired. Mormons believed, long after most of the country had ceased to, that women's moral purity made them particularly suited to participation in civic life. Let me say that again, because it's important. Mormons believed that women's moral purity made them particularly suited to participation in civic life outside the home. By the late 1950s, geographic isolation was less potent in maintaining group cohesion, and there were no more wars with the federal government. And the Mormon family starts to look a lot like American families, but always with one more child. The Mormon birth rate tracks the national one with one more child added. This is the moment that Moss identifies as the point where the pendulum had swung as far towards assimilation as the group could tolerate and still remain coherent. Here's his description. Mormons of the 1960s were generally a highly assimilated group of Americans. In educational attainment, occupational status, and community size of origin, it would have been difficult to distinguish most Mormons from others. In civic and political attitudes, too, Mormons were already well within the American mainstream. With some variation in party preferences among the Mormon samples, they were all generally quite close to their non-Mormon neighbors. In the specific domestic and foreign policy issues of the time, there was as much diversity among Mormons as among others, suggesting that civic and political attitudes were not much informed by religious beliefs or commitments. The main tendency of Mormon views was neither very liberal nor very conservative, but quite centrist and moderate. Only in the realm of lifestyle did we see evidence of lagging assimilation. Maybe not lagging, but Moss also points out that Mormon peculiarity has always been important, on a mythic level at least, to Mormons. And so the idea that Mormons were different has always been strenuously maintained in rhetoric, if not always in fact, as he points out about the late 50s and early 60s. So the decade of the 60s, broadly, and feminism particularly, provided new sources of tension against which Mormonism could define itself. Here too, though, the locus of resistance is coded feminine, and again it reaches back for older ideas about femininity, preserving the anomalous post-war middle-class Mormon family overlaid with Victorian sentimentality as Mormonism's last form of resistance to complete assimilation. Ironically, women's moral purity, which in the early days of Utah statehood had been adduced to explain women's particular suitability for involvement in civic life, is now marshaled as an argument that women should not be sullied by involvement in the dirty world of business and politics. Mormon women are once again, however, charged with maintaining and demonstrating Mormon peculiarity. Church President Spencer W. Kimball made this explicit when he said, "Much of the major growth that is coming to the church in the last days," and every woman in here has heard this a million times, "will come because many of the good women of the world, as opposed to the evil, unmaternal others with whom he had contrasted women in the preceding paragraphs." That part's not a quote. "Will be drawn to the church in large numbers. This will happen to the degree that the women of the church reflect righteousness and articulateness in their lives, and to the degree that the women of the church are seen as different and distinct in happy ways from the women of the world." The insistence of second-wave feminism that the personal is political seems to have driven Mormon women to abandon all political and civic involvement as a mode of resistance. Rather than the public resistance to modern American capitalism and individualism that characterized the early Utah period, and in which women and men participated together, the resistance to cultural trends of the 60s was left almost entirely to women, who were expected to maintain and defend a calcified domesticity, while Mormon men were encouraged to participate fully in American corporate life. Men, too, were taught that no other success can compensate for failure in the home, so that the pressures of providing and new insistence on paternal involvement in sentimentalized domestic life, see the collected sermons of President McKay, for instance, left little room for civic participation. Moreover, the "every member a missionary" mantra rendered all interactions with non-Mormons potential opportunities for conversion, so that what civic life there was tended to be subsumed by religious sensibilities. The migration of Mormons out of Utah matters here, too. Outside of the Mormon cultural region, Mormon idiosyncrasies were far more likely to be tolerated and even admired in business than in politics. At the same time, the rise of the correlation movement within the church did even more to circumscribe women's lives into the domestic sphere, because the social work they had done through the church was subsumed into the priesthood organizational structure. By the late 1970s, Mormons who had a century before made domestic arrangements the defining characteristic of their civic engagement had made devotion to a rarefied isolationist domesticity a political statement. The effect of some of these changes was a retreat to domesticity, the creation of a discourse about home as a refuge from the world. Zion shrank to the size of a suburban colonial with a half-acre lot in a good school district. There are a few hiccups, a little blip of Mormon feminism that was essentially eradicated in the early 90s, a generation of women polarized over the ERA and its aftermath. But as President Hinckley once pointed out to a reporter in an atypically cynical moment, the church was baptizing huge numbers of women in more conservative cultures for every one uppity American woman who let go of the iron rod. Moreover, the entire culture of the U.S. was fragmenting over social issues, so if Mormons are no longer out-Americaning all the Americans, they do find a very comfortable place in the ranks of the culture warriors on the right. and gays and lesbians arrive just after feminists as convenient public enemy number one. Proposition 8 wins. Mormon mommy blogs garner national attention for being so adorably wholesome, and a few colorful outliers are trotted, some of whom are in this room, are trotted out as evidence of how comfy and wonderful Mormonism is for all kinds of people, and all is well in Zion. Except, of course, that it isn't. A new generation of girls has grown up with the benefits of feminism solidly established. It no longer seems controversial to them that they should enjoy the same education and employment opportunities as men. In fact, they come of age in an educational system in which women now routinely outperform men by almost all measures. Commitment to motherhood is strenuously enforced in the Young Women's Program. I said beaten into them, but that's a little too strong. The proclamation on the family now appears in almost every single category of values that the young women are supposed to set goals in. It figures prominently as something that they are supposed to refer to, memorize, or practice elements of in every area of their aspirational religious lives. Many of them have barely heard the word housewife. It doesn't make sense to them. Mormon mommy blogging is mostly not evidence of spiritual conviction, but of lifestyle choice. Here's an excerpt from a recent Salon article extolling the delights of Mormon mommy blogs. Quote, "At first glance, Naomi and Stacy and Stephanie and Liz appear to be members of the species known as the hipster mommy blogger, though perhaps a bit more cheerful and wholesome than most, differing from the world in happy ways. They have bangs like Zooey Deschanel and closets full of cool vintage dresses. Their houses look like anthropology catalogs. Their kids look like baby Gap models. Their husbands look like young graphic designers, all cute lumberjack shirts and square-framed glasses. They spend their days doing fun craft projects, vintagey owl throw pillow, recycled button earrings, hand-stamped linen napkins. They spend their weekends throwing big, whimsical dinner parties for their friends, all of whom have equally adorable kids and husbands. But as you page through their blog archives, you notice certain tells. They're super young, like 4 kids at 29 young. They mention relatives in Utah. They drink a suspicious amount of hot chocolate. Finally, you see it, a subtly placed widget with a picture of the temple or a hyperlink on the word faith or belief. You click the link and up pops the official website of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So the church has been quite successful in making one particular form of family life, that is, the husband-wife with the wife at home with children, the central commitment of young Mormon adults. But unlike, say, conservative evangelical Christians who wrote the Prairie Muffin Manifesto, do any of you know the Prairie Muffin Manifesto? Google it when you get home. It's delightful.
Or don't.
Oh.
It's horrifying.
Well, let me just read you a few of their points, because it's important to understand this as a very religiously articulated commitment to homemaking, which I think we kind of lack in Mormonism, or it's not as specific. Here's what they say. Prairie muffins. I could explain the name, but it would take too long. Anyway, they are committed to obeying God's law in every area of life, as they are aware of its application to their lives and circumstances. They are helpmeets to their husbands, seeking creative and practical ways to further their husbands' callings and aid them in their dominion responsibilities. They are aware that God is in control of their ability to conceive and bear children, and they are content to allow him to bless them as he chooses in this area. They are creative, learning new skills and working with their hands to provide items of beauty as well as utility for their families. So there's that radical homemaking. They do not reflect badly on their husbands by neglecting their appearance. They work with the clay God has given, molding it into an attractive package for the pleasure of their husbands. But here's a less amusing but more important one. They appreciate godly role models such as Anne Bradstreet, Elizabeth Prentice, and Elizabeth Elliot. They do not idolize Laura Ingalls Wilder of Little House on the Prairie books or Louisa May Alcott, Little Women. While they may enjoy aspects of the home life presented in those books, Prairie Muffins understand that the latent humanism and feminism in these stories and in the lives of these women is not worthy of emulation. Yeah, so that's really different from the way that Mormons talk about the exact same form of family, the ideal of the mother at home with children. So Mormon women by and large, have no particularly Mormon rationale for their choices. They are encouraged to be educated and in many ways to participate in modern economies and social structures along with their husbands. One blogger all too aptly described Mormon rhetoric about male headship as chicken patriarchy. What Mormon mommy blogs do clearly demonstrate is an embrace of American consumer culture and the Generation Y commitment to self-expression. Mormonism is a part of these bloggers' personal brand to the extent that their chosen lifestyles mirror the post-70s LDS commitment to a particular family form. Note that in the excerpt above from Salon, the information about Mormonism is found in subtly placed widgets or a hyperlink on some innocuous term like faith.